October 27, 1962. A Soviet submarine called B-59 is underwater in the Atlantic Ocean, 480 kilometers from the United States coast. It carries a nuclear torpedo with a 1-kiloton warhead, the same power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Above, American destroyers are dropping depth charges. The submarine systems are failing. The radio is broken. The captain believes the nuclear war has already started on the surface. He has the authority to launch the nuclear torpedo, and he's about to make a decision that could have killed millions. This is the story of how we came closer to nuclear annihilation than almost anyone knows. This is Buried Truths. By October 1962, the Cold War had become unbearably tense. The Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev had begun secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When American spy planes discovered the missiles, President John F. Kennedy faced a choice: invade Cuba or blockade the island and force the Soviets to back down. Kennedy chose the blockade. He called it a quarantine to avoid using military language. American Navy ships formed a perimeter around Cuba. Any Soviet vessel attempting to reach the island would be stopped. If they refused to stop, they would be fired upon. The world held its breath. Soviet ships were steaming toward Cuba. American ships were positioned to intercept them. Nuclear weapons were on high alert in both countries. Missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. Soviet missiles in Cuba pointed at America. It was the closest the world had come to nuclear war since the invention of atomic weapons. But what the American government didn't know, what the world didn't know, was that the Soviets had sent submarines to Cuba. Submarines carrying nuclear weapons. And one of those submarines was about to operate in a situation where communication with Moscow was impossible, where the captain would face a decision that could start World War III. That submarine was B-59. B-59 was a Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine. It was state-of-the-art for 1962. It was fast, maneuverable, and equipped with advanced sonar. It carried 78 crew members and officers, and it carried a nuclear torpedo. Not a typical torpedo with conventional explosives, but a weapon that could destroy an entire American naval task force in a single blast. The captain of B-59 was Valentin Savitsky. He was an experienced submarine commander, trusted by the Soviet Navy. He had navigated difficult situations before, but nothing like what he was about to face. B-59 left the Soviet Union and traveled westward toward Cuba. The journey took weeks. During that time, the Cuban Missile Crisis developed on the surface. The world was being brought to the brink of nuclear war. B-59's orders were simple: reach Cuba without being detected, deliver supplies and reinforcements to the Soviet military base there, and return home. The submarine was to avoid confrontation at all costs. If detected, it was to evade and escape. But Savitsky didn't have any way to receive updated information. The submarine's radio system was limited. It could receive low-frequency transmissions from Moscow, but only at very specific times. And even those transmissions were often incomplete or garbled. On October 27th, B-59 was nearing Cuba. It was traveling through heavily patrolled American waters. The submarine was running on diesel engines near the surface, trying to recharge its batteries. It was in a vulnerable state. Then the lookout spotted them, American destroyers, and they were heading directly toward B-59. The American destroyers had detected a submarine on sonar. They didn't know it was a Soviet nuclear submarine. They thought it might be any submarine, Soviet, Cuban, or unknown. The American Navy had orders to force any submarine to surface and identify itself. The destroyers began signaling. They flashed lights. They fired warning shots across the water. Then they began dropping depth charges. Depth charges are not designed to sink a submarine. They're designed to force a submarine to surface. The underwater explosions create shock waves that damage the submarine systems and frighten the crew. Under international law at that time, a depth charge attack was a recognized way to order a submarine to surface. But to the crew of B-59, underwater in the darkness, hearing explosions all around them, it felt like war. It felt like the United States had attacked them. It felt like World War III had started. Captain Savitsky ordered the submarine to dive, deeper and deeper, fleeing the explosions. The submarine's systems began to strain. The hull groaned. Water began leaking. The temperature inside rose to over 50 degrees Celsius, over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air became toxic. Men were passing out from heat and lack of oxygen. But still the depth charges came. Explosion after explosion. The submarine was being hunted. The crew believed this was an actual attack. Then something worse happened. The submarine's radio system failed completely. It couldn't receive any transmissions from Moscow. Savitsky was completely cut off from the Soviet leadership. He had no way to know what was happening on the surface. He had no way to receive new orders. He didn't know if the nuclear war had already started. For all he knew, the United States was attacking Soviet cities. Soviet missiles might already be falling on American targets. The world might already be at war. Savitsky convened an emergency meeting of his senior officers. The submarine was damaged. The crew was suffering. The radio was dead. American destroyers were attacking them. Under Soviet protocol, a submarine captain could authorize the use of the nuclear torpedo in 3 situations. If the submarine was sunk, if it received direct orders from Moscow, or if the captain determined that war had already begun based on the tactical situation. Savitsky believed the third condition had been met. The depth charges were an attack. The radio was dead, possibly due to an American electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear explosion. The United States was attacking Soviet submarines. War had begun. Savitsky issued an order: prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. The submarine's political officer, the Communist Party representative aboard, was named Ivan Maslenikov. Political officers had significant authority in the Soviet Navy. They could advise captains and, in some cases, overrule them. Maslenikov understood the implications. If B-59 launched a nuclear torpedo at American destroyers, America would respond. Soviet cities would be destroyed. Millions would die. The Third World War would begin. Maslenikov opposed the launch. He argued that Savitsky should wait, should try to establish radio contact, should attempt to surface and determine what was actually happening. Savitsky was torn. His training told him to launch. The tactical situation seemed to justify it, but Maslenikov's argument gave him pause. Then something happened that changed everything. The depth charges stopped. The American destroyers had decided that whatever submarine was down there, it wasn't going to surface. They had fired enough depth charges. They had other duties. They resumed their normal patrol pattern, moving away from the damaged submarine. Inside B-59, in the darkness and the heat, Savitsky made a decision. He would not launch. He would surface and see what was actually happening. B-59 rose slowly through the water. The crew was prepared for the worst, for an immediate attack from above. But when the submarine broke the surface, the American destroyers did nothing. They didn't fire. They didn't attack. They simply watched. The radio operators desperately tried to re-establish communication with Moscow. Slowly, through fragmentary transmissions, the crew of B-59 learned the truth. There was no nuclear war. The American destroyers had been trying to force them to surface, not attacking them. The crisis on the surface was ongoing but had not escalated to nuclear weapons. The submarine that had come closer to starting World War III than any other in history had been saved by the decisions of two men. A captain who was willing to listen to his political officer, and a political officer who was willing to question a military order. For decades, the story of B-59 remained classified. Neither the American government nor the Soviet government revealed how close the world had come. The incident wasn't discussed. It wasn't analyzed. It was simply forgotten. It wasn't until 2002, 40 years later, that the full story emerged. A Russian documentary filmmaker named Stepan Sherbakov interviewed the surviving officers from B-59. The crew's families shared documents that had been preserved. Historians pieced together the timeline. The world learned that on October 27, 1962, a single submarine captain had stood at a crossroads. One decision launches a nuclear weapon. The other decision doesn't. One decision ends human civilization as we know it. The other decision allows life to continue. Valentin Savitsky made the right decision. And he made it in darkness, with limited information, under extreme stress, believing that his country was under attack. He died in 1999 without ever being publicly recognized for what he had done. His decision to not launch a nuclear weapon during a moment when he believed nuclear war had begun wasn't celebrated. It wasn't even known. Ivan Maslenikov, the political officer who argued against the launch, lived until 2004. He gave interviews in his final years, describing the moment when he believed he might be responsible for the end of the world. The world came within seconds of nuclear annihilation, not because of a miscalculation in Moscow or Washington, not because of a military conspiracy, but because of a Soviet submarine operating in isolation, receiving depth-charge attacks, with a radio that couldn't receive the information that would have prevented a catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis is taught in schools as a moment when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. But most people don't know about B-59. They don't know that the brink was even closer than the official history suggests. They don't know that a single decision by a single captain prevented millions of deaths. For 40 years, the story was buried. When it finally emerged, it should have shocked the world. Instead, it was largely forgotten within weeks. The submarines with nuclear weapons are still out there, still operating in isolation, still carrying the capability to start wars that nobody wants. The systems that failed B-59 in 1962 have been improved, but the fundamental problem remains. Submarines at sea can lose communication with their home countries. When that happens, the captain alone bears the responsibility for decisions that could kill millions. On October 27, 1962, Valentin Savitsky made the right choice. But he made it in darkness, with incomplete information, and under the belief that his country was dying. We were extraordinarily lucky, and luck is not a strategy for nuclear deterrence. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe to Buried Truths. Every week, another moment in history that almost ended us, fully documented and fully sourced. One submarine, one decision, 40 years of silence.